You're questioning the past and you're wondering why. Time to check out History High.
Welcome to History High. On the 16th of January 1969, Jan Palach, a 20-year-old Czech student, walked into Wenceslas Square in central Prague, poured petrol on himself and lit a match. He died 3 days later, signing his suicide note with the 3 words, Torch Number 1. Palach's death was followed by a number of other students setting themselves on fire, and Palach's cremated ashes were hidden for years afterwards, so his burial site didn't become a shrine. But what drove this young man to such an extreme act? The answer lies in the major event which is the subject of this video, the Prague Spring of 1968. This video is aimed at GCSE students studying the Cold War. By the end of the video, you should be able to explain the causes, features and consequences of the Prague Spring. So let's start with what caused the Prague Spring. I find causes easier to remember if I divide them into 3. It also helps for flashcards for an explain why question, as it gives you 3 peel or 3 paragraphs to write about. When it comes to the causes of the Prague Spring, you might want to remember PSE, the causes of the Prague Spring events. The first P stands for protests. There had been huge student protests against the hardline government of Antonin Novotny in 1966. These protests scared the Soviet Union, as the protesters started to see themselves as part of the global protest movement of the 1960s. The second cause of the Prague Spring, and the main cause of the protests in the first place, was Soviet control. In 1948, Stalin had supported a coup in Czechoslovakia which had established a pro-Soviet government. The secret police were used to maintain control, and there was little freedom of speech. Radio and newspapers were censored. And while Soviet control was a long-term cause of the protests, a declining economy was the final trigger. In the 1960s, living standards fell dramatically, and Novotny's attempts to reform what he called the new economic model had dramatically failed. This eventually led to his replacement by Alexander Dubček. Think Dubček, Czechoslovakia. Don't confuse Dubček with Imre Nagy, who was the leader of the Hungarian uprising in 1956. So, these 3 causes lead us on to the events of the Prague Spring themselves. It's useful to think of the Prague Spring in 2 parts, the Prague Spring reforms and the Soviet reaction to them. The funny thing about the Prague Spring was, unlike in Hungary in 1956, Dubček was not actually seen as a major threat to the status quo. The Soviet leader Brezhnev trusted him, and Dubček was committed to the Warsaw Pact. Dubček introduced a series of reforms from April 1968, which became known as the Prague Spring. Remember, it's easy to remember the date of these reforms. It's called Spring for a reason. Dubček said he didn't want to get rid of socialism. He just wanted a friendlier version, or as he called it, socialism with a human face. His reforms included, and you might want to pause the video here to jot some of these down: relaxation of censorship, more powers for trade unions, trade with the West, greater freedom to travel abroad, and the discussion of multi-party elections. Dubček's reforms were enthusiastically received in Czechoslovakia, but the Soviet reaction was not so enthusiastic. Brezhnev panicked that other Warsaw Pact countries would also want these same reforms. At this point, Romania was refusing to attend Warsaw Pact meetings, and the Yugoslavian leader Tito refused to accept Moscow's control. When Dubček invited the Romanian leader Ceausescu and Tito to have talks, this was too much for Brezhnev. And so, on the 20th of August 1968, 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops invaded Czechoslovakia and ended the Prague Spring for good. There was little opposition to the invasion, although there were individual acts of bravery. Soviet troops had actually been told that they'd been invited in by the Czech government, so they were shocked by the hostility they faced. Dubček was arrested, sent to Moscow, and replaced in 1969 by Gustav Husak, who clamped down and arrested over 1,000 Czechs. So, we've looked at the causes and features. Let's finish by looking at the consequences of this major event. In an exam, you could get a question that asks you to write a narrative account of the Prague Spring, but you're more likely to get a question about the impact on international relations. The impact of the Prague Spring can be split into 4 different areas. I remember these with the mnemonic, "Don't worry, communists invade," which sums up a key consequence of the Prague Spring, the Brezhnev Doctrine. Pause and jot down these areas now. In terms of the domestic impact, the invasion ended the Prague Spring. Dubček was sacked, and Czechoslovakia returned to strict control by Moscow. In terms of the impact on other communist countries in the Warsaw Pact, perhaps the most important consequence was what became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. On the 26th of September 1968, the Soviet newspaper Pravda said that the actions of any individual communist country affected all other communist countries, and therefore, if one country's actions threatened communism, it was the duty of the others to act. This became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, and ultimately led to greater control over other Warsaw Pact countries. The Prague Spring also led to strained relations with other communist parties in Europe. The communist parties of Italy and France cut links to Moscow. Yugoslavia and Romania both condemned the invasion, while East Germany and Poland, who had felt threatened by the Prague Spring, actually welcomed Brezhnev's actions. There were also consequences of the Cold War itself. The USA were outraged by the invasion, tried to pass a resolution at the UN, but this was vetoed by the USSR. Finally, there were consequences for the USA's international reputation. At this time, the USA was involved in an expensive and disastrous war in North Vietnam and was beginning to adopt a policy of détente. Other countries saw that the USA was keen to criticise the Soviet Union but was not prepared to take action. Finally, a summary page will come up on the screen now of the causes, features and consequences of the Prague Spring. Pause the video after the summary to check that you can add evidence to each of the words on the screen. So, why did Jan Palach set himself on fire in January 1969? Well, to protest against the suppression of the Prague Spring. And while certainly a brave act, his death reminds us that for movements to be truly successful, they have to involve the masses of ordinary people, who can together build a real socialism with a human face, not the Stalinist version that Dubček and the Soviet Union were debating in 1968. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other Cold War videos, like, subscribe, and thanks for watching.
So if you're questioning the past,